They say the safest place in a lion's den is where the lions don't look. Varen Hale had built her entire life on that principle: invisible, silent, surviving. But tonight, at the Ashford Manor's glittering winter ball, Duke Cale Draven looked. And when a man like him sees you, truly sees you, in a world where attention can kill, everything you've survived becomes meaningless. This is the story of a woman who learned to disappear, a man who refused to look away, and the moment one glance shattered the rules of an entire society. Stay until the end to see how she fights back. Drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. The crystal chandelier cast fractured light across the ballroom floor, and Varen Hale moved through it like smoke, present but not quite there, visible but never seen. She'd perfected the angle of her shoulders, the downward tilt of her chin, the way her feet whispered across marble without making a sound. 15 years of service had taught her that survival wasn't about being strong. It was about being forgettable. "More champagne here!" Lady Ashford snapped her fingers without looking, her voice cutting through the orchestra's waltz. Varen materialized at her elbow with a tray, filled the crystal flute, and vanished before the lady even registered her presence. Perfect. The Ashford Manor Winter Ball was the event of the season. 300 of the wealthiest, most powerful people in the kingdom crammed into one ballroom, peacocking their status, while servants like Varen made sure their glasses never emptied and their egos never deflated. She'd worked these events for a decade. She knew the rhythm. Stay in motion, stay useful, stay invisible. Did you see the Duchess of Wellborn's necklace? Absolutely garish. I heard the Markhams are drowning in debt, though you'd never know it from Cale Draven is here. The name cut through the ambient gossip like a blade through silk. Varen's hand stuttered for just a second as she poured wine into Lord Pemberton's glass, a tiny tremor that made the liquid splash against the rim. She recovered instantly, but her heart had already started beating faster. Everyone knew about Duke Cale Draven. You didn't survive in service without knowing the names that mattered, and his mattered more than most. 32 years old, obscenely wealthy, ruthlessly intelligent, and according to every piece of gossip that filtered down to the servants' quarters, completely devoid of warmth. He'd inherited the Draven Duchy at 20 when his father died under mysterious circumstances, and in the 12 years since, he'd tripled the family fortune while cutting his social circle down to almost nothing. He didn't attend balls, he didn't make small talk, he didn't pretend, and he was here. Why would he come? Someone whispered behind a fan. He hasn't been to a social event in 3 years. Lady Ashford must have offered him something substantial, or threatened him with something worse. Varen kept moving, kept pouring, kept existing in that sweet spot of useful invisibility. But some part of her, the part she usually kept locked down tight, wanted to see him, wanted to see if the rumors were true, wanted to know what a man looked like when he stopped pretending the world's rules applied to him. She was refilling the brandy decanters on the side table when she felt it, that electric prickle on the back of her neck that meant someone was watching. She'd learned to recognize that feeling years ago. Usually it meant a drunk lord getting handsy, or a lady about to complain about temperature or lighting or some other thing Varen couldn't control. She turned, smile fixed and neutral, ready to deflect. Cale Draven was looking directly at her. Not past her, not through her, at her. The room didn't actually stop, but Varen's perception of it fractured into slow motion. The orchestra kept playing, couples kept dancing, gossip kept flowing. But in the space between her heartbeats, everything else became background noise. He stood near the far windows, a glass of something amber in his hand, completely alone in a room packed with people desperate for his attention. Tall, taller than she'd expected, with dark hair that looked like he'd dragged his hands through it too many times, and shoulders that filled out his formal jacket in a way that suggested real work, not just tailoring. His face was all sharp angles and harder edges, the kind of face that didn't soften for anyone. But his eyes. They were gray, or maybe blue. The light made it impossible to tell, and they were looking at her with an intensity that made her skin feel too tight. Varen did what she'd been trained to do. She looked away, broke eye contact, became invisible again. She moved to the next table, hands steady despite her racing pulse, and focused on straightening the placement of dessert forks. Professional, invisible, safe. You missed a glass. The voice came from directly behind her, low and rough like gravel sliding across stone. Varen's spine went rigid. She turned slowly, and there he was, Cale Draven, standing 3 feet away holding out an empty tumbler. Up close, he was somehow more and less than the rumors suggested. More real, less mythical. His formal jacket was unbuttoned at the collar, his bow tie slightly crooked, and there was a faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow that the society papers never mentioned. "My apologies, Your Grace." Varen took the glass, her fingers careful not to touch his. "I'll refill it immediately." She turned toward the brandy, but his voice stopped her. "Don't." Varen froze. In 15 years of service, she'd learned every possible instruction. Bring this. Take that. Hurry. Wait. But don't? That was new. She turned back, keeping her eyes properly lowered. "Your Grace?" "Don't apologize for something that isn't your fault." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was commenting on the weather. "And don't pretend you didn't notice half the decanters on that table were already empty when you got to them." Heat crept up Varen's neck. He'd been watching her work, actually watching, not glancing over while talking to someone more important, watching. "I should refill them," she said quietly. "Why?" The question caught her off guard. "Because it's my job." "Is it?" Kyle tilted his head slightly, studying her like she was a puzzle he hadn't solved yet. "Or is your job to be invisible while other people take credit for the work you do?" Varen's throat went dry. This was dangerous, this conversation, this attention, this man who looked at her like she was a person instead of a piece of furniture. All of it was dangerous. "I should get back to work," she said, the words coming out firmer than she intended. For a moment, Kyle just looked at her. Then he did something she'd never seen a duke do. He smiled. Not the practiced political smile she'd seen on 100 noble faces. Something smaller, more real. "You should," he agreed, "but you won't apologize for it." It wasn't a question. It was almost permission. Before Varen could figure out how to respond, Lady Ashford's voice cut through the ballroom like a whip crack. "Varen, where is that girl? We need more champagne at the head table immediately." The spell broke. Reality crashed back. Varen ducked her head in a quick, respectful nod to Kyle and hurried toward the kitchens, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, she felt his eyes following her path across the room. The kitchens were chaos. Steam and shouting and the crash of plates mixing into a familiar symphony that Varen could navigate blind. She grabbed 2 fresh bottles of champagne and turned to head back out, but Martha, the head housekeeper and the closest thing Varen had to a friend, caught her arm. "What did he say to you?" Martha's eyes were wide, her voice pitched low under the kitchen noise. "Who?" "Don't play stupid. The Duke. Everyone saw him talking to you." Varen's stomach dropped. "Everyone? You were standing in the middle of the ballroom having a conversation with Cale Bloody Draven. Yes, everyone saw." Martha's grip tightened. "What did he want?" "Nothing. He just handed me his glass." "For 3 minutes?" "It wasn't 3 minutes. It was at least 3 minutes. I timed it." Martha leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Be careful, Varen. Men like that don't notice girls like us unless they want something, and what they want is never good for us." Varen wanted to argue, but Martha wasn't wrong. The rules of their world were clear. Nobles and servants didn't mix except in the ways that benefited the nobles. Attention from someone like Cale Draven could only end badly. "I'm always careful," Varen said. Martha studied her face for a long moment, then sighed and released her arm. "I know you are. That's what worries me." Varen made it back to the ballroom without incident, distributed the champagne, and spent the next 2 hours working double time to avoid even the possibility of crossing Kyle Draven's path again. She stuck to the far side of the room, moved faster than usual, kept her eyes down and her shoulders angled away from where she'd last seen him. It almost worked. She was collecting empty glasses from a table near the terrace doors when she heard Lady Ashford's voice rise above the general din, sharp with excitement. "Your Grace, how wonderful that you could join us tonight. We so rarely have the pleasure." Lady Ashford. Cale's voice was polite but flat, completely devoid of the warmth Lady Ashford was aiming for. Your hospitality is noted. I was hoping we might discuss the railway expansion through your northern territories. My husband has some proposals. Send them to my secretary. Of course, but I thought perhaps a more personal conversation would waste both our time. Send them to my secretary. Varen risked a glance. Lady Ashford's face had gone tight with poorly concealed offense, but she was covering it with a strained smile. Cale looked utterly unbothered by her discomfort. He stood with his hands in his pockets, a casual pose that somehow made him look more dangerous, not less, and his expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. If you'll excuse me. Cale didn't wait for permission before walking away, leaving Lady Ashford standing alone with her mouth slightly open. The crowd parted for him automatically, nobles stepping aside like he carried some invisible force field. He moved through them without acknowledging a single person, his path cutting straight across the ballroom toward Varen. No, she had to be imagining it. He was heading toward the terrace, or the library, or literally anywhere except directly at her. He stopped 3 feet away. You're avoiding me. Not a question. A statement. Varen clutched the tray of empty glasses tighter. Around them she could feel attention sharpening, conversations pausing mid-sentence as people noticed where Kyle Draven had stopped, and who he was talking to. I'm working, Your Grace. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. Kyle's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Fair enough? He glanced at the tray in her hands. You're good at this. At carrying glasses? At being invisible. He said it without judgment, just observation. Most people do it by being boring. You do it by being useful. Varen's chest tightened. She'd spent 15 years perfecting that skill, and he'd dissected it in 2 sentences. I need to return to the kitchens, she said. In a moment. Kyle pulled a card from his jacket pocket and held it out. This is the address of my city residence. If you're ever looking for different employment, bring this to the service entrance. Varen stared at the card like it was a snake. I have employment. You have exploitation. Kyle kept his hand extended. I'm offering you a choice. Why? The question burst out before she could stop it. Why would you offer me anything? For the first time since he'd approached her, Kyle's expression shifted into something harder to read. Because you looked at me like I was a person, not a title. That's rarer than you'd think. Varen's hands were shaking. She set the tray down on the nearest surface before she dropped it and took the card. The paper was heavy, expensive, with an address embossed in silver ink. Thank you, Your Grace. Kyle. She looked up sharply. What? My name is Kyle. If you're going to work for me, you should probably know it. I haven't agreed. You will. He said it with absolute certainty, then turned and walked away before she could form a response. Varen stood frozen, the card burning in her palm, while the ballroom buzzed with renewed gossip around her. By morning, everyone in the servant quarters knew about the Duke's offer. By afternoon, Lady Ashford had called Varen into her private study. Is it true? Lady Ashford sat behind her mahogany desk, fingers steepled, eyes cold. Did Duke Draven offer you employment? Varen stood with her hands clasped in front of her, spine straight, face neutral. He gave me his card, my lady. And I haven't decided what to do with it. Lady Ashford's laugh was sharp and humorless. Haven't decided? Girl, do you understand what kind of opportunity this is? Varen said nothing. Experience had taught her that questions like that were traps. The Duke is one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Lady Ashford stood, moving around the desk to circle Varen like a predator sizing up prey. A recommendation from him could open doors for this household, connections, contracts, access. Ah, there it was. Lady Ashford didn't care about Varen's opportunity. She cared about her own. You'll accept his offer, Lady Ashford continued. You'll work in his household for 1 year, and you'll report back to me about his business dealings, his social calendar, his vulnerabilities. Varen's blood went cold. You want me to spy on him? I want you to be useful. Lady Ashford stopped directly in front of her. You've served this household for 15 years, Varen. Surely you feel some loyalty. Loyalty. The word tasted like ash. 15 years of 12-hour days of eating scraps, of sleeping in a room barely bigger than a closet, of being invisible unless someone needed something. That was the loyalty Lady Ashford was calling in. "And if I refuse?" Varen asked quietly. Lady Ashford's smile was razor thin. "Then I'll make sure every household in the city knows you're not to be trusted. You'll be unemployable, destitute, and whatever fantasy you have about Duke Draven rescuing you will die the moment he realizes you come with that kind of reputation." The threat hung in the air between them, ugly and absolute. Varen had spent her entire life learning to survive, learning to disappear, learning to bend without breaking. But standing in that study with Lady Ashford's ultimatum pressing down on her shoulders, something inside her finally cracked. Not broke. Cracked. And through that crack, something new pushed through. "I'll think about it," Varen said. Lady Ashford's eyes narrowed. "I'll think about it," Varen repeated, stronger this time. "And I'll give you my answer tomorrow." She didn't wait for permission to leave. She turned and walked out of the study, her legs shaking but her spine straight, while Lady Ashford's outraged voice followed her into the hallway. Martha found her 20 minutes later, sitting on her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, Kael's card still clutched in her hand. "You know you can't trust him," Martha said quietly, sitting down beside her. "Men like that, they don't help people like us without wanting something in return." "I know. And Lady Ashford will destroy you if you cross her." "I know that too." Martha was quiet for a moment, then put a hand on Varen's shoulder. "So what are you going to do?" Varen looked down at the card in her hand, the address embossed in silver, the weight of possibility it represented. For 15 years she'd survived by being invisible, by being useful, by never asking for more than scraps. And look where it had gotten her. "I'm going to make a choice," Varen said softly. "For the first time in my life, I'm going to make my own choice. Even if it's dangerous? Especially if it's dangerous." Martha squeezed her shoulder. "Then I hope you're ready for what comes next." Varen wasn't, but she was tired of being ready for other people's plans, tired of surviving on scraps, tired of being invisible. Kael Draven had looked at her like she was a person, just once, just for a moment, but it had been enough to remind her that she was. The next morning, Varen packed her few belongings into a single worn bag, left a letter of resignation on Lady Ashford's desk, and walked out of the manor before sunrise. She didn't look back. The address on Kael's card led to a townhouse in the most expensive district of the city, all white stone and black iron, with windows that caught the early light and threw it back like polished mirrors. Varen stood across the street for 10 minutes, fear and determination warring in her chest. Then she crossed the street and knocked on the service entrance. An older woman with sharp eyes and graying hair opened the door. "Yes?" "I'm looking for employment." Varen held out the card. "Duke Draven gave me this." The woman took the card, studied it, then studied Varen with the same intensity. "You're the girl from the Ashford ball." It wasn't a question, but Varen nodded anyway. "Wait here." The door closed. Varen waited, her heart beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. What if this was a mistake? What if Martha was right? What if... The door opened again. The older woman gestured inside. "His Grace will see you. Follow me." The interior of the townhouse was elegant but surprisingly understated. No gilded frames or crystal chandeliers, just clean lines and quality craftsmanship. The woman led her through a series of hallways to a study lined with books, where Kael sat behind a desk covered in papers. He looked up when they entered, and for a second, just a second, something that might have been relief crossed his face. "You came," he said. "You gave me a reason to." Kael stood, coming around the desk. In the morning light, he looked tired, like he'd been up all night working. "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I." The older woman cleared her throat. "Your Grace, shall I prepare the employment contracts?" "Not yet." Kael's eyes never left Varen's face. "First, I need to make something clear. If you work here, you work for me. Not as a spy for someone else. Not as a favor to another household. For me. And I don't accept divided loyalties." Varen's breath caught. He knew. Somehow, he knew about Lady Ashford's demand. "How did you Because that's exactly what I would do if I were Lady Ashford, Kael said bluntly. You're leverage now. The question is whether you're willing to be used as it. The question hung between them, sharp and honest. Varen thought about 15 years of being invisible, of being used without ever being asked, of surviving on scraps while people like Lady Ashford fed off her labor. I'm not anyone's leverage, she said quietly. Not anymore. Kael smiled, that same small, real smile from the ballroom. Good. Then let's talk about what you actually want. And for the first time in her life, someone asked Varen what she wanted instead of telling her what to do. The world outside the townhouse kept turning. Lady Ashford was already spreading poison about Varen's character. The society that had ignored her existence was about to start paying very close attention. And somewhere in the shadows, forces were gathering that would test everything Varen thought she knew about survival. But in that moment, standing in Kael Draven's study, with morning light streaming through the windows, Varen Hale made a choice. She stopped disappearing, and the world would never be the same. The first rule Varen learned in Kael's household was that nothing came without a price. The second rule was that the price was always higher than you expected. Mrs. Brennan, the sharp-eyed woman who'd opened the service door, ran the townhouse with military precision. She gave Varen a room on the third floor, small but private, with an actual window that let in real sunlight. The mattress didn't sag. The walls didn't have water stains. There was a lock on the door that Varen controlled. It felt like luxury. It felt like a trap. You'll start in the household accounts, Mrs. Brennan said, leading Varen through the townhouse on her second morning. His Grace needs someone who can organize the mess his previous secretary left behind. Can you read and write? Yes. Do numbers? Well enough. Mrs. Brennan's expression suggested she'd believe it when she saw it. You'll work in the study. Don't touch anything on His Grace's desk. Don't read his private correspondence. Don't gossip about what you see. And for heaven's sake, don't make me regret vouching for you. You vouched for me? Someone had to. Mrs. Brennan stopped outside the study door. His Grace has instincts about people, but instincts don't pay wages or prevent theft. I told him you were worth the risk. Don't make a liar out of me. The study was exactly as Varen remembered it. Books lining the walls, papers scattered across every surface, morning light streaming through tall windows. Kyle sat behind his desk, reading something that made his jaw tight. Mrs. Brennan says you need help with accounts, Varen said from the doorway. Kyle looked up, and some of the tension in his face eased. I need help with everything, but accounts are where the previous disaster was most creative. He gestured to a stack of ledgers on the side table. My former secretary had an artistic approach to mathematics. Nothing adds up. Half the entries are illegible, and I'm fairly certain he was embezzling. Fairly certain? I can't prove it yet. That's why I need someone better at numbers than I am. Varen moved to the side table and opened the top ledger. The handwriting was atrocious, the columns misaligned, and she flipped back 3 pages. The same expense was listed twice with different amounts. This is bad, she said. I know. No, I mean, this is really bad. If you submitted these to a bank or investor, they'd laugh you out of the building. Kyle leaned back in his chair, something that might have been amusement flickering across his face. Are you always this blunt? Would you prefer I lie? I'd prefer you keep doing exactly what you're doing. He stood and came around the desk. How long will it take to fix? Varen did quick mental math. If I work 10 hours a day, 3 weeks. Maybe 4. You'll work 8 hours a day. 10 if you choose to, but I won't require it. She looked at him sharply. Why not? Because I'm not Lady Ashford. Kael said it without malice, just fact. I don't run my household on exploitation. The words hit harder than Varen expected. She turned back to the ledgers before he could see her face. I'll start today. Good. I'll have Mrs. Brennan bring you tea. I know you don't need it, but you'll have it anyway. Kael left before she could argue, and Varen stood alone in the study, surrounded by someone else's disaster, wondering what she'd actually gotten herself into. The work was brutal. Not physically, sitting at a desk was easier than hauling trays of champagne, but mentally. Every entry had to be cross-referenced, every expense verified, every discrepancy tracked down and corrected. By the end of the first day, Varen's eyes burned and her head throbbed. By the end of the first week, she'd uncovered evidence of systematic theft that went back 2 years. He was stealing from the tenant rents, Varen said, spreading the corrected ledgers across Kael's desk. Small amounts each month, never enough to raise immediate suspicion, but over 2 years it adds up to nearly 8,000 crowns. Kael's expression went dangerously cold. 8,000. And that's just what I've found so far. I haven't finished the investment accounts. Do you have proof? Varen pulled out a separate sheet where she'd documented every discrepancy. Dates, amounts, and the corresponding legitimate expenses he used to hide the theft. It's all here. Kael read through her notes in silence, his jaw getting tighter with each line. When he finished, he set the paper down with careful precision and looked at her. You did this in a week. It's not that impressive. He wasn't very good at hiding it. My previous accountant spent 6 months telling me the books were fine. Kael's voice was quiet but sharp. Either he was incompetent or complicit. You found the truth in 7 days. Varen shifted uncomfortably under his stare. I just looked at what was actually there instead of what should have been there. Most people don't know the difference. Then most people aren't very good at their jobs. Kael's mouth twitched, almost a smile. No, they're not. He stood, gathering the ledgers. I'm taking this to my solicitor. The previous secretary is about to have a very bad day. What about the accountant? He'll have an even worse one. Kael left with the evidence, and Varen sat alone in the study, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline she didn't know she'd been holding. She'd just exposed 2 men who'd been stealing from one of the most powerful dukes in the kingdom, men who now had every reason to hate her. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like victory. The news spread through the household by evening. Servants whispered in corners. Mrs. Brennan gave Varen a look that was equal parts approval and warning. And when Kael returned from his solicitor, he brought news that changed everything. They're both going to trial, he said, finding Varen in the study where she'd moved on to the investment accounts. Criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. Good. They're going to retaliate. Varen's hand stilled on the ledger. Against you? Against you. Kael pulled up a chair and sat facing her, his expression serious. The secretary is from a minor noble family. The accountant has connections. They can't touch me directly, but you? You're vulnerable. I can handle it. Can you? He wasn't challenging her, just asking. Because handling it means having your reputation destroyed, being followed, being harassed. It means every mistake you've ever made becoming public knowledge and every lie they can invent becoming gospel. Varen's throat went tight. Then what do you suggest? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what's coming so you can decide if you still want to be part of it. The words settled between them, heavy and honest. Kael wasn't trying to protect her. He was giving her a choice, the same thing he'd done in Lady Ashford's ballroom. I'm staying, Varen said. You're certain? They stole from you. They stole from your tenants, people who probably can't afford to lose 8,000 crowns worth of rent over 2 years. Someone should hold them accountable. That someone doesn't have to be you. Yes, Varen said quietly. It does. Kael studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. All right. Then we do this together. Together. The word felt foreign, dangerous, like something Varen shouldn't trust but desperately wanted to. What happens now? She asked. Now we prepare for war. The first attack came 3 days later, and it came from Lady Ashford. Varen was walking back from the market. Mrs. Brennan had sent her for fresh herbs when she saw the crowd gathered outside a coffee house. People were reading something posted on the wall, their voices rising in that particular pitch that meant gossip was turning into scandal. She should have kept walking, should have gone straight back to the townhouse, but some terrible instinct made her move closer. The notice was printed on expensive paper, the text laid out like a formal announcement. Public notice. Be it known that Miss Varen Hale, formerly employed by the Ashford household, abandoned her position without notice and is suspected of theft. Any household considering her employment should be advised of her untrustworthiness and poor character. Below that, Lady Ashford's signature, bold and damning. Varen's vision tunneled. She heard voices around her but couldn't make out words. Someone laughed. Someone else said, "I heard she was trying to trap the Duke into marriage." Theft and gold digging. What a combination. Poor Duke Draven, taking in a viper like that. Varen turned and walked away before she could hear more. Her face burning, her hands clenched so tight her nails cut into her palms. She made it 2 blocks before her legs gave out and she had to grab a wall for support. 15 years. 15 years of perfect service, of never taking what wasn't offered, of being useful and invisible and good. And with one piece of paper, Lady Ashford had destroyed it all. "Varen?" She looked up. Cale stood 5 feet away, still dressed for business, his expression carved from stone. "You saw it," she managed. "Half the city has seen it by now. Lady Ashford posted them in every fashionable district." He moved closer, his voice dropping. "Come back to the townhouse. We need to respond." "Respond with what? She's a lady. I'm nobody. Who's going to believe me over her?" "I will." The certainty in his voice nearly broke her. Varen shook her head, pushing away from the wall. "That'll just make it worse. They'll say I manipulated you, that I'm using you for protection." "Let them say it." "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Cale's voice went hard. "You're afraid that being associated with me will destroy what little reputation you have left. But Varen, that reputation is already gone. Lady Ashford made sure of it. The question now is whether you're going to let her win or if you're going to fight back." "Fight back with what? I have nothing." "You have the truth, and you have me." Varen laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. "You're a duke. You can't be seen defending a servant accused of theft. Watch me." He said it with such absolute conviction that Varen almost believed him. Almost. "This is a mistake," she whispered. "Probably." Kyle held out his hand. "But it's our mistake to make." Varen looked at his outstretched hand, calloused, scarred, utterly steady, and thought about all the choices that had led her here. Working for Lady Ashford, taking Cale's card, uncovering the theft, choosing visibility over safety. Every choice had made her more vulnerable. Every choice had put her deeper in danger, and every choice had been hers. She took his hand. Cale's response to Lady Ashford's notice appeared the next morning, posted in all the same locations. Public response: Lady Ashford's accusations against Miss Varen Hale are demonstrably false. Miss Hale left her position through proper resignation and has since provided exemplary service in my household. Any claims of theft or poor character are libelous and will be treated as such under law. Duke Cale Draven. The scandal erupted like a powder keg. Society couldn't decide who to believe, the lady who'd been a fixture of high society for decades, or the Duke who never spoke publicly about anything. Camps formed. Arguments broke out at dinner parties. The gossip papers ran 3 different versions of the story, each more sensational than the last. And through it all, Varen worked. She finished correcting the household accounts, started organizing Kale's business correspondence, learned the names of his tenants and the details of his investments. Mrs. Brennan taught her how the household operated, and piece by piece, Varen built something she'd never had before, competence that couldn't be dismissed as luck. But the attention was suffocating. She couldn't walk to the market without being recognized, couldn't go anywhere without whispers following her. Servants from other households crossed the street to avoid her. Shop owners who'd never noticed her before now watched her like she might steal their inventory. "You should fire me," Varen told Kyle one evening. They were in his study, her working through correspondence while he reviewed contracts. "The scandal is hurting you." "Is it?" Cale didn't look up from his papers. "My business partners still show up to meetings. My solicitor still takes my calls. My tenants still pay rent. Who exactly is being hurt?" "Your reputation was never good to begin with. I'm known for being cold, ruthless, and unsociable. If anything, publicly defending you makes me seem more human." "That's not funny." "It's not meant to be." Cale set down his papers and looked at her. "You think I don't understand what this costs you, but I do. I see how you flinch every time someone stares. I see how you've started taking the back routes to avoid crowds. I know this is hell." Varen's throat tightened. "Then why?" "Because you deserve better than hell, and because someone should have defended you 15 years ago. But since they didn't, I'm doing it now." The words hit like a physical blow. Varen blinked hard against sudden tears, turning back to her work before Kael could see how much his defense meant. But he saw anyway. He always saw. The situation reached its breaking point 2 weeks later at the Merchants Guild quarterly dinner. Kael had been invited as a major investor. He'd initially declined. He always declined, but this time he accepted, and he brought Varen as his secretary. "This is insane," Varen said as their carriage pulled up to the guild hall. "I can't go in there." "Why not?" "Because every person in that building has read Lady Ashford's notice. They think I'm a thief." "Then we'll prove them wrong." Kael adjusted his cufflinks, his expression calm. "You're my secretary. You have every right to be here." "Kael, if you don't want to go, we'll turn around right now. But if you do want to go, then walk in there with your head up and let them see who you really are." Varen's hands were shaking. She clasped them together in her lap, breathing through the fear that threatened to choke her. She could stay in the carriage, stay safe, stay invisible. Or she could walk into that guild hall and face every person who believed the worst about her. "I hate you a little bit right now," she said. Kael's mouth twitched. "I can live with that." The guild hall went silent when they entered. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Varen felt the weight of hundreds of eyes assessing her, judging her, finding her wanting. Her instinct screamed to run, to disappear, to become invisible again. But Kael's hand settled at the small of her back, not pushing, just steadying, and she forced herself to keep walking. They made it 3 steps before Lord Pemberton blocked their path. "Draven," he said, his tone friendly but his eyes cold. "Surprised to see you here, and with such interesting company." "My secretary," Kael said flatly. "Miss Hale manages my business accounts." "Does she?" Pemberton's smile was sharp. "I would have thought you'd be more careful about who handles your money, given recent allegations." The threat was barely veiled. Varen felt her face heat, but before she could respond, Kael stepped forward, putting himself between her and Pemberton. "The only recent allegations that concern me are the ones Lady Ashford made without evidence." Kael's voice was dangerously soft. "But I'm sure you weren't suggesting that baseless gossip should determine someone's character. Were you, Pemberton?" Pemberton's smile flickered. "Of course not. I simply meant, I know exactly what you meant. Now move." The word landed like a hammer. Pemberton's face went red, but he stepped aside and Kael guided Varen past him into the main hall. "You didn't have to do that," Varen whispered. "Yes, I did." The dinner was agony. Varen sat beside Kael at the high table, acutely aware of every stare, every whisper, every pointed comment that floated across the room. The woman across from them asked Kael if he was sure he could trust his financial records to someone so inexperienced. The man next to her made a joke about keeping the silverware counted. Someone laughed. Varen's appetite died. She pushed food around her plate, her stomach churning with humiliation and rage. Then Kael set down his fork and stood. The room gradually quieted, people turning to look at the Duke, who never made speeches, never drew attention, never engaged with society's games. "I have an announcement," Kael said, his voice carrying across the hall. "Miss Hale has recently uncovered evidence of systematic fraud and embezzlement in my household accounts. 2 men are currently awaiting trial because of her diligence and skill." The room went deadly silent. "She found theft that my previous accountant, a man recommended by several people in this room, failed to detect over 6 months. She documented it, organized it, and provided evidence that my solicitor called exceptional." Kael's gaze swept the room, cold and precise. "So before anyone else makes assumptions about her character based on gossip, consider what she's actually accomplished. Then ask yourself if you'd have the courage to expose powerful criminals knowing the personal cost." He sat down. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then someone started clapping, slow, deliberate applause that gradually spread through the room. Not everyone joined in, but enough did that the message was clear. Varen sat frozen, her heart hammering, while beside her, Kyle calmly picked up his fork and continued eating like he hadn't just publicly defended her in front of the city's most powerful merchants. "You're completely insane," she whispered. "Yes," Kyle agreed, "but I'm right." After dinner, as guests mingled and made business connections, Varen found herself cornered by three women she recognized from Lady Ashford's circles. "So you're the infamous Miss Hale," one of them said, her smile sweet and poisonous. "Tell me, how does one go from servant to secretary in a duke's household? It must require special talents." The implication was clear. Varen's face burned, but she kept her voice level. "It requires the ability to add, subtract, and spot a fraud. Apparently those are rare talents." "How clever. But surely you understand why people are suspicious. A duke taking in a servant accused of theft? It looks rather desperate." "Or it looks like someone judging competence over gossip," Varen said. "But I suppose that's also a rare talent." The woman's eyes narrowed. "You should be careful, Miss Hale. Society has a long memory for those who don't know their place." "Good. Then society will remember I'm the one who caught the criminals no one else could find." She turned and walked away before the women could respond, her legs shaking so badly she nearly stumbled. She made it to the retiring room and locked herself in a stall, pressing her forehead against the cool wood while she tried to breathe through the adrenaline crash. She'd just verbally sparred with society women, defended herself, refused to back down. And she hadn't apologized once. The door to the retiring room opened. Footsteps. Then Mrs. Brennan's voice. "Miss Hale, His Grace is asking for you." Varen straightened, smoothed her dress, and emerged from the stall. Mrs. Brennan stood by the mirror, her expression unreadable. "You held your ground," Mrs. Brennan said quietly. "I lost my temper." "You found your spine. There's a difference." Mrs. Brennan handed her a handkerchief. "Fix your face. You've got more fighting to do tonight." But the fighting was already over. When Varen returned to the main hall, she found Kyle in conversation with a cluster of merchants who seemed genuinely interested in his business proposals rather than his scandal. Several people nodded to her as she passed. Not friendly exactly, but not hostile either. Pemberton was gone. So were the poisonous women. And when she took her place beside Kyle, he glanced at her and said, "Ready to go home?" Home. The word shouldn't have meant anything, but it hit her chest like a punch. "Yes," Varen said. "I'm ready." They made it to the carriage without incident, and as the horses pulled away from the Guildhall, Varen finally let herself slump against the seat. "That was the worst night of my life," she said. "You survived it." "Barely. Barely counts." Kyle was quiet for a moment. "You know they're not going to stop. Lady Ashford will find new ways to attack. Society will keep testing you. It's going to get worse before it gets better." "I know." "And you're still staying?" Varen looked at him. This impossible man who'd seen her when she was invisible, defended her when she was vulnerable, and refused to let her disappear back into the shadows. "I'm still staying," she said, "but not because of you." Kale's eyebrow rose. "No?" "No. I'm staying because for the first time in my life, I'm not running from something. I'm fighting for something. And that's worth whatever hell comes next." Kale smiled, that rare, real smile that transformed his face. "Good. Because hell is definitely coming." He wasn't wrong. The next morning, Varen woke to find a letter slipped under her door. The paper was expensive, the handwriting elegant, the message brief. "You've made powerful enemies, Miss Hale. Think carefully about whether Duke Draven's protection is worth your life. No signature, no return address, just a threat wrapped in civilized language." Varen's hands shook as she read it, then read it again, then walked downstairs to Kyle's study and handed it to him without a word. He read it once, his expression going cold and dangerous. "Someone threatened you." "Yes." "In my house." "Yes." Kale stood, the letter crumpling in his fist. "Pack your things. You're moving to the main floor, into the room next to mine." "Kyle." That wasn't a request. His voice was steel wrapped in ice. "If someone can slip a letter under your door, they can slip something worse. You're moving now." This is exactly what they want. They want you to look desperate, like you're protecting me because I am protecting you. Kyle moved around the desk. And I don't give a damn what it looks like. Your safety matters more than anyone's opinion. Varen wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could handle herself, but the truth was, she was terrified. The letter proved that her enemies knew where she slept, knew she was vulnerable, knew they could reach her anytime they wanted. I'll pack, she said quietly. Good. And Varen? Kyle waited until she met his eyes. Whoever sent that letter just made the biggest mistake of their life. Because now I'm not just defending you. I'm going to war. The promise in his voice should have comforted her. Instead, it made her realize just how high the stakes had become, and how far she'd fallen into a world where visibility didn't just risk reputation, it risked everything. The room next to Kyle's was 3 times the size of her previous quarters, with windows that overlooked the garden and furniture that looked like it cost more than Varen had earned in 5 years at the Ashford Manor. She stood in the doorway with her single bag of belongings, feeling like an imposter playing dress-up in someone else's life. You can still say no, Kyle said from behind her. To what? The room or the war? Both. Varen stepped inside, setting her bag on the bed. If I say no to the room, someone might kill me. If I say no to the war, someone definitely will. Not much of a choice. There's always a choice. She turned to face him. Is there? Because from where I'm standing, every choice I've made has led me deeper into a fight I never asked for. You asked for it the moment you stopped being invisible. Kale leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. The world doesn't forgive people who step out of their assigned place. You knew that. Knowing it and living it are different things. Yes, they are. His expression softened slightly. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start finding out who sent that letter. He left before she could ask how he planned to do that, and Varen was alone in her new room with its expensive furniture and garden view and the crushing weight of visibility pressing down on her chest. She didn't sleep that night. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow looked like a threat. By dawn, she was exhausted and wired and ready to crawl out of her own skin. Mrs. Brennan found her in the kitchen at sunrise, making tea with shaking hands. You look terrible, Mrs. Brennan said bluntly. Thank you. That's exactly what I needed to hear. I'm not trying to comfort you. I'm stating facts. Mrs. Brennan took the kettle from Varen's hands and finished making the tea herself. Sit down before you fall down. Varen sat. Mrs. Brennan poured 2 cups and settled across from her, her sharp eyes assessing. How long have you worked for Kyle? Varen asked. 12 years, since his father died. What was he like, before? Mrs. Brennan's expression flickered with something that might have been sadness. Different, softer. His father's death changed him. How did he die? Officially? Heart failure. Unofficially? Mrs. Brennan's voice dropped. There were rumors. Poison, political enemies, business rivals. Nothing was ever proven, but Kyle became harder after that. More careful. More ruthless. The words settled like ice in Varen's stomach. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to understand what kind of man you're trusting. Kale will protect you, but his protection comes with a cost. He'll burn down anyone who threatens what's his, and he doesn't care about collateral damage. What's his? Varen's voice came out sharper than intended. I'm not his property. Aren't you? Mrs. Brennan met her eyes. You live in his house, work in his study, sleep in the room next to his. He's publicly defended you, threatened your enemies, and declared war on anyone who hurts you. That's not just protection, girl. That's possession. The words hit like a slap. Varen wanted to argue, to insist Mrs. Brennan was wrong, but the truth was more complicated. Kyle had given her choices, yes, but were they real choices when the alternative was poverty or death? What do you want me to do? Varen asked quietly. Leave? I want you to be smart. Kyle is a good man in his way, but he's also dangerous. And right now, you're in the center of a fight that could destroy you both. Before Varen could respond, Kale appeared in the kitchen doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour. We have a problem, he said. Mrs. Brennan stood immediately. What kind of problem? The kind that requires a lawyer, a magistrate, and possibly a small army. Cale's expression was carved from granite. Lady Ashford is pressing charges against Varen for theft. The air left Varen's lungs. What? She claims you stole jewelry from her household before you left. Filed a formal complaint with the magistrate's office this morning. Cale's jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. It's scheduled for a hearing in 3 days. That's insane. I know, but she has witnesses. 3 servants who claim they saw you with the jewelry in question. Varen's vision grayed at the edges. This wasn't just scandal anymore. This was criminal. If Lady Ashford won, Varen wouldn't just lose her reputation. She'd lose her freedom, maybe her life. She's going to win, Varen heard herself say. 3 witnesses against my word? She's going to win. Not if we fight back, Kyle said. With what? I have nothing. No witnesses, no evidence, no... You have me, and you have the truth. Kyle moved closer, his voice dropping. Lady Ashford is making a mistake. She's so focused on destroying you that she's forgotten I have resources she can't match. Money, connections, and a very expensive legal team that specializes in destroying false accusations. It won't matter. She's a lady. I'm nobody. You're not nobody. The force in Kyle's voice made her look up. And I'm done watching you believe that you are. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning in the magistrate's court. Kyle spent the weekend closeted with his lawyers, building a defense while Varen tried not to fall apart. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, kept imagining herself in prison, or worse, all because she'd dared to stop being invisible. Sunday night, she found herself in the garden at midnight, staring at nothing while her mind spun in circles. You're going to freeze out here. Varen turned. Kale stood on the terrace, holding 2 coats. He came down the steps and draped one around her shoulders before she could protest. I couldn't sleep, she said. Neither could I. Kale settled beside her on the garden bench, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. My lawyers think we have a case. What kind of case? The witnesses Lady Ashford produced all have ties to her household. One of them was fired 6 months ago for incompetence. Another is in debt. The third is the housekeeper's niece. Kale's voice was clinical, but his hands were clenched. They're not credible. And the jewelry she claims you stole? It wasn't reported missing until 3 weeks ago, weeks after you left. So she's fabricating evidence. Yes. And your lawyers can prove it? They'll try. Kale was quiet for a moment. But Varen, you need to understand something. Even if we win, this doesn't end. Lady Ashford will try again. She'll find new accusations, new weapons, new ways to hurt you. This fight could last years. Then why bother fighting? The words came out bitter and exhausted. Why not just let her win and be done with it? Because that's what she wants. For you to give up, to disappear, to prove that people like you can't challenge people like her and survive. Maybe she's right. Kyle turned to face her, his expression fierce. She's not. And you know she's not. Or you wouldn't have walked into that guild hall. You wouldn't have confronted those women. You wouldn't be sitting here right now instead of running. I want to run, Varen whispered. I want to run so badly. I can taste it. I know, but you won't, because you're braver than you think you are, and you're tired of being afraid. The truth of it cut deep. Varen looked at Kyle, really looked at him, and saw exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, tension in his shoulders, and something else she couldn't name in the way he looked at her. Why are you doing this? She asked. Really, not the political answer or the noble answer. Why? Kyle was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, because someone should have protected you 15 years ago, and they didn't. Because I watched you survive in that ballroom, invisible and useful and slowly dying, and I couldn't look away. Because when you looked at me, you saw a person, not a title. And because... He stopped, something vulnerable flickering across his face. Because you make me remember what it's like to care about something other than survival. The words hung between them, raw and honest and dangerous. Varen's breath caught. Kyle, don't. He stood abruptly. Don't say anything. Not now. Not when we're both tired and scared and the world is trying to destroy us. Just get some sleep. We have a fight to win tomorrow. He left before she could find her voice, and Varen sat alone in the garden with his coat around her shoulders and the weight of his confession pressing against her chest. Monday morning arrived too fast and too slow. Varen dressed in her plainest clothes, no jewelry, no embellishments, nothing that could be used against her. Mrs. Brennan braided her hair tight and handed her a handkerchief. "For the tears," Mrs. Brennan said. "I'm not going to cry. You might. But if you do, don't let them see it until after the verdict." The magistrate's court was smaller than Varen expected, all dark wood and high windows that let in harsh morning light. Lady Ashford sat on one side with her lawyers and 3 servants Varen vaguely recognized. Kyle sat on the other side with his legal team, 4 men in expensive suits who looked like they could argue the sun into setting early. Varen sat beside Kyle, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles went white. "Breathe," Kyle murmured. "I am breathing." "Then breathe slower. You look like you're about to pass out." The magistrate entered, a middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She reviewed the complaint, looked at both parties, and said, "This is a preliminary hearing to determine if there's sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Lady Ashford, present your case." Lady Ashford's lawyer stood, smooth and practiced. He laid out the accusation. Varen had stolen a diamond necklace and matching earrings worth 3,000 crowns. He called the 3 witnesses, who testified that they'd seen Varen with the jewelry the day before she left. The testimony was polished, too polished. The witnesses barely looked at Varen, focusing instead on the magistrate with expressions of practiced sincerity. When they finished, Kyle's lead lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Garrett, stood and tore them apart. "You claim you saw Miss Hale with the jewelry on the morning of April 3rd. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," the first witness said. "And where exactly did you see her?" "In the servants' hall." "What time?" "Around 7 in the morning." Garrett pulled out a document. According to the Ashford household schedule, Miss Hale was serving breakfast in the main dining room from 6:30 until 8:30 that morning. She couldn't have been in the servants' hall at 7. The witness faltered. Maybe it was earlier? Maybe? Or definitely? Which is it?" Lady Ashford's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. Garrett moved to the second witness, then the third, systematically destroying their credibility with documentation, schedules, and pointed questions about their connections to Lady Ashford. By the time he finished, all 3 witnesses looked like liars, and Lady Ashford's face had gone pale with barely controlled fury. Then Garrett played his final card. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit evidence that the jewelry in question was not reported missing until 3 weeks after Miss Hale left Lady Ashford's employment. If Miss Hale had stolen it, surely Lady Ashford would have noticed immediately." He produced insurance records, inventory logs, and a letter from Lady Ashford's own insurance company confirming the delayed report. The magistrate's expression shifted from neutral to skeptical. "Lady Ashford, can you explain this discrepancy?" Lady Ashford stood, her voice cold and controlled. "The theft was discovered during a routine inventory. I didn't want to make accusations without being certain." "Yet you're certain now." "Yes." "Based on testimony from witnesses who can't keep their timeline straight and a report filed weeks after the alleged theft?" The magistrate's tone had gone sharp. "Lady Ashford, this court does not appreciate having its time wasted with fabricated accusations. I am not fabricating. This hearing is concluded. There is insufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Case dismissed." The gavel came down, and Varen's vision blurred with relief so intense it felt like drowning. Beside her, Kyle let out a breath he'd been holding, and his hand found hers under the table, squeezing once. They won. But the victory lasted exactly as long as it took to leave the courthouse. A crowd had gathered outside, reporters, gossips, and people who just wanted to see the scandal up close. Varen kept her head down as Kyle guided her toward their carriage, but a voice cut through the noise. "Duke Draven, is it true you're keeping Miss Hale as your mistress?" Varen's step faltered. Kyle's hand tightened on her arm, but he didn't stop walking. "Your Grace, are you planning to marry her, or is this just an arrangement?" "How much are you paying her to warm your bed?" The questions got cruder, louder, more vicious. Varen's face burned. She wanted to turn around, to scream at them, to defend herself, but Kyle kept her moving forward until they reached the carriage. The door slammed shut, cutting off the noise, and Varen finally let herself break. Not crying, she wouldn't give them that, but something close. Her whole body shook with rage and humiliation and exhaustion. "They think I'm your whore," she said, her voice cracking. "They're wrong." "It doesn't matter if they're wrong. That's what they'll say. That's what everyone will believe." Kale was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "What if we gave them something else to believe?" Varen looked up. "What do you mean?" "Marry me." The words dropped like stones into water, sending ripples through everything Varen thought she understood. "You're not serious." "I'm completely serious." Kale leaned forward, his expression intense. "They're calling you my mistress, my plaything. Let's give them a different story. Marry me and you become a duchess. Untouchable. Protected by law and title and everything society claims to value. That's insane. It's strategic. It's a lie." "Is it?" Kale's voice went quiet. "I've spent 2 months watching you survive what would break most people. I've seen you fight when you had every reason to give up. You're brilliant and brave, and you refuse to disappear, even when disappearing would be easier. Why wouldn't I want to marry you?" Varen's heart hammered against her ribs. "Because you don't love me. I don't know what I feel for you, but I know it's more than I've felt for anyone in 12 years. And I know I'd rather face scandal with you than face safety without you." The confession hit harder than any declaration of love could have. Varen stared at him, this impossible man who'd turned her world upside down and tried to find solid ground. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "it can't be a strategy. I won't be your political chess piece. Then what do you want it to be?" "Real." The word came out fierce and desperate. "If we do this, it has to be real. Messy and complicated and real. No pretending." Kale's expression softened into something that looked like relief. "I don't know how to pretend with you. I've tried. It doesn't work." "That's not a proposal. Isn't it?" "No. If you're going to ask me to marry you, do it properly." For the first time since the hearing, Kyle smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his face. He slid off the carriage seat and onto one knee in the cramped space, taking her hand. "Varen Hale, will you marry me? Not because it's strategic or safe or politically advantageous, but because I want to spend the rest of my life watching you refuse to be invisible." Varen's breath caught. She should say no, should run, should protect herself from the absolute disaster this marriage would be. But she was tired of protecting herself, tired of being invisible, tired of surviving instead of living. "Yes," she said, "but if you make me regret this, I'll make you pay for it." "I'd expect nothing less." He kissed her then, right there in the carriage, and for one perfect moment, the world outside didn't matter. The moment lasted until they reached the townhouse and found Mrs. Brennan waiting with a letter, her face grim. "This arrived by courier," she said, handing it to Kale. "It's from the Draven family estate." Kale opened it, read 3 lines, and went completely still. "What?" Varen asked. "What is it?" "My uncle." Kale's voice was flat, emotionless. "He's calling a family council to discuss my recent choices." "Your marriage proposal, you mean?" "News travels fast in our circles." Kale's hand crumpled the letter. "He's going to challenge my competence, try to take control of the duchy. He's been waiting for an excuse for 12 years, and I just gave him one." Varen's stomach dropped. Can he do that? If he gets enough family votes, yes. The Draven Duchy has rules about maintaining the family reputation. Marrying a woman accused of theft, even falsely, could be grounds for declaring me unfit to lead. Then don't marry me. What? Call it off. Tell everyone it was a misunderstanding. Protect yourself. Kale stared at her like she'd suggested burning down the house. You think I'd abandon you to save my title? I think you'd be smart to. I think I'd be a coward. Kyle moved closer, his eyes blazing. I made you a promise. I'm keeping it. Even if it destroys you? Especially then. The conviction in his voice should have comforted her. Instead, it terrified her. because Varen was starting to realize that this fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something bigger, more dangerous. It was about choosing love over safety, truth over strategy, each other over everything else, and those choices had consequences neither of them could predict. The family council was scheduled for Friday, 3 days to prepare for a fight that could cost Kyle everything. They spent those days in his study, surrounded by lawyers and family law books and strategy sessions that made Varen's head spin. Cale's uncle, Lord Cyrus Draven, was methodical and ruthless, with allies throughout the family and enough dirt on half the noble houses to make most people hesitate before opposing him. "He'll attack your character," Garrett said, pacing the study. "Claim you're unstable, impulsive, unable to lead, and he'll use your engagement to Miss Hale as evidence." "Let him try," Cale said. "Your Grace, with respect, this isn't a battle you can win through defiance. You need strategy." "I have strategy. I'm going to tell the truth." Garrett looked pained. "The truth rarely wins these fights." "Then we'll be the exception." Friday arrived like a death sentence. The family council met at the Draven ancestral estate, a massive stone fortress 2 hours outside the city. Varen watched from the carriage window as they approached, her stomach churning with dread. "You don't have to come," Kyle said. "Yes, I do. This fight is about me. I should be there." "They'll try to destroy you." "They've been trying that for months. I'm still standing." Cale's hand found hers. "If this goes badly, it won't. But if it does, then we'll figure it out together." Varen squeezed his fingers. "That's what marriage means, right? Facing disaster together?" "I'm starting to think you have a very pessimistic view of marriage." "I'm starting to think I'm a realist." The council room was everything Varen expected. High ceilings, expensive furniture, and 20 members of the Draven family arranged like a jury. Lord Cyrus sat at the head of the table, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, radiating controlled power. "Nephew," he said as Kyle entered, "and this must be the young woman causing all the trouble." "This is my fiancée," Kale corrected. "Varen Hale, soon to be Varen Draven." "If this council allows it," Cyrus said smoothly, "please sit. We have much to discuss." The accusations started immediately. Cyrus laid them out with surgical precision. Cale's isolation from the family, his refusal to marry appropriately, his defense of a woman accused of theft, and now his engagement to that same woman. Each point was calculated to make Kale look unstable, emotional, unfit to lead. "You're risking the family reputation," Cyrus concluded. "For what? A woman you barely know? A servant with no connections, no breeding, no value beyond whatever hold she has over you?" Varen's hands clenched in her lap. Kale's expression went dangerously cold. "Careful," Kale said softly. "You're talking about my future wife." "I'm talking about a liability." Cyrus turned to the rest of the council. "I move that we declare Duke Draven temporarily unfit to manage the family holdings until he demonstrates more sound judgment." Several council members nodded. Others looked uncertain. The room split down the middle, and Varen realized with sick certainty that this vote could go either way. Then Kyle stood. "You want to know why I'm marrying Varen?" His voice carried across the room. "Because she's the only person in 12 years who looked at me and saw a human being instead of a title or a target. Because she's brilliant and brave, and she fights when most people would surrender. Because she uncovered theft that our family accountant missed, and she did it while being threatened, slandered, and attacked from every direction. And because I'd rather have her beside me than have the approval of people who only value blood and breeding over character." The silence was absolute. "So vote however you want," Kale continued. "Take my title if you think that matters. But I'm marrying her regardless. And if that makes me unfit to lead this family, then maybe this family isn't worth leading." Cyrus's face had gone red with fury. "You're throwing away centuries of tradition." "I'm choosing the future over the past." Kale's voice was steel. "The question is whether you're brave enough to do the same." The vote was called. Varen watched, her heart in her throat, as council members raised their hands for or against. It was close, so close Varen couldn't breathe, and when the final count came in, they won by 2 votes. 2 votes between Kyle keeping his title and losing everything. Cyrus stood, his expression murderous. This isn't over. Yes, Kael said quietly. It is. They left the estate in silence, exhaustion and relief mixing into something that felt like survival. Varen leaned against Kael's shoulder in the carriage, too tired to sit upright. We won, she said. Barely. Barely counts. Kael huffed something that might have been a laugh. You're right, it does. They made it halfway home before the carriage lurched to a sudden stop. Kael straightened immediately, his hand going to Varen's arm. What? The door jerked open. Two men in dark clothes, faces covered, reached in and grabbed Varen before she could scream. She fought, kicking and clawing, but they were strong and fast, and they dragged her out of the carriage while Kael shouted and lunged after her. Someone hit him. Varen saw him go down, blood on his face, and then a cloth pressed over her mouth and nose, chemical sweet and suffocating. Her vision grayed. The world spun. The last thing she heard was Kael's voice, desperate and furious, calling her name. Then darkness swallowed her whole. Varen woke to darkness and the smell of damp stone. Her head throbbed where the chemical had burned through her consciousness, and her wrists ached from rope cutting into skin. She tried to move and realized she was tied to a chair in what felt like a cellar, cold, windowless, silent except for the drip of water somewhere in the distance. Panic clawed at her throat. She forced it down, forced herself to breathe, to think. The last thing she remembered was Kael's face, blood streaming from his temple as he tried to reach her. Was he alive? Hurt? Already searching for her? The question spiraled until footsteps echoed on stone stairs. A door opened. Light spilled in, blinding after the darkness. Varen squinted against it as a figure descended. A woman in expensive clothes, her face carefully composed. Lady Ashford. You're awake. Good. Lady Ashford settled into a chair across from Varen, crossing her legs like they were having tea instead of a kidnapping. We have things to discuss. Where's Kael? Varen's voice came out rough. Your Duke? Alive, I assume. My men were instructed not to kill him, just slow him down long enough to bring you here. Lady Ashford smiled, cold and satisfied. He's probably tearing apart the city looking for you right now. How romantic. What do you want? What I've always wanted, for you to disappear. Lady Ashford leaned forward. But you wouldn't do it quietly, would you? You had to fight, had to make a spectacle, had to drag Duke Draven into your pathetic little drama until he actually proposed to you. The contempt in her voice was visceral. Varen met her eyes and said, You're terrified. Lady Ashford's smile froze. Excuse me? You're terrified that I proved you wrong, that a servant with no connections and no breeding could stand up to you and win. That scares you more than anything I could actually do. You haven't won anything, haven't I? I survived your accusations, won in court, got engaged to one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, and you're so desperate to stop me that you resorted to kidnapping. Varen's laugh was harsh. That's not the behavior of someone who's winning. Lady Ashford's hand cracked across Varen's face before she saw it coming. Pain exploded through her cheek, bright and sharp. Varen tasted blood. You will learn your place, Lady Ashford hissed, one way or another. She stood and moved toward the stairs, then paused. Lord Cyrus sends his regards, by the way. He was very helpful in arranging this little meeting. Turns out he shares my feelings about unsuitable marriages. The words hit like ice water. Cyrus, Kael's uncle, had helped orchestrate her kidnapping. You're working together, Varen said. We have mutual interests. He wants Duke Draven's title. I want you gone. It's very tidy. Lady Ashford smiled. You'll stay here until Duke Draven agrees to end your engagement and surrender certain business holdings to Cyrus. If he refuses, well, accidents happen to women like you all the time. No one even notices. She left, and the door slammed shut, plunging Varen back into darkness. Varen had exactly 3 advantages. Lady Ashford underestimated her. The rope around her wrist was tied by someone who didn't know how to properly restrain a person, and she'd spent 15 years learning to solve problems in the dark. The rope trick was something she'd learned from a stable hand at the Ashford Manor. If you kept your wrists flexed while being tied, you created slack when you relaxed. It wasn't much, but it was something. Varen worked at it slowly, carefully, ignoring the burn as rope scraped skin. Blood helped, made everything slippery. It took 2 hours, maybe 3. Time moved strangely in the dark. But eventually her right hand slipped free, then her left, and Varen was standing on shaking legs, feeling her way around the cellar. Stone walls. Locked door. No windows. But there. Her fingers found a grate in the floor, probably for drainage. She knelt and tested it. Loose. Very loose. She pried it up and found a narrow tunnel underneath, maybe 2 feet wide, sloping downward into darkness. It could lead nowhere. Could be a dead end. Could drop her into an underground river or worse. But it was a chance. Varen lowered herself into the tunnel and started crawling. The tunnel was a nightmare of tight spaces and sharp rocks and water that soaked through her dress until she was shivering so hard her teeth chattered. She had no light, no sense of direction, no idea if she was crawling toward freedom or death. She crawled anyway. Time became meaningless. Her hands bled. Her knees screamed. Something skittered past her in the dark. Rats, probably. And she bit down on a scream because making noise felt dangerous even though there was no one to hear. Then, after what felt like hours, she saw it. Light. Faint. Gray. Filtering through what looked like a grate ahead. Varen crawled faster, ignoring pain, ignoring exhaustion, until she reached the grate and pushed. It didn't budge. She pushed harder, putting her back into it, and the grate shifted with a groan of rusted metal. She squeezed through and found herself in an alley behind what looked like an abandoned warehouse. Dawn was breaking, pale light creeping over rooftops, and Varen stood there dripping and bloody and free, trying to figure out where she was. The docks. She could smell salt water and fish, hear the distant call of gulls. She was near the river district, miles from Kael's townhouse. Varen started walking. She made it 3 blocks before someone grabbed her arm. Varen spun, ready to fight, and found herself staring at Mrs. Brennan. "Sweet mercy," Mrs. Brennan breathed. "You're alive." "How did you?" "His Grace has half the city searching for you. Every street, every building, every damn rat hole." Mrs. Brennan pulled off her cloak and wrapped it around Varen's shoulders. "Come on. We need to get you somewhere safe." "No." Varen caught her arm. "No hiding. Take me to Kael." "You need a doctor." "I need Kael. Now." Mrs. Brennan studied her face, then nodded once. "All right, but you're going to give him a heart attack." They found Kael in his study, surrounded by maps and city guards and pure, barely controlled chaos. He looked like he hadn't slept, hair wild, shirt untucked, a bandage wrapped around his head where he'd been hit. When Varen walked through the door, he went completely still. "Varen." Her name came out broken. Kael crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her against him, his arms shaking as they wrapped around her. Varen felt him breathe her in, felt the tremor in his chest, and realized he'd thought she was dead. "I'm here," she said against his shoulder. "I'm here." "How?" His voice cracked. He pulled back just enough to see her face, and his expression went murderous when he saw the bruise on her cheek. "Who did this?" "Lady Ashford, and your uncle." The room went silent. Every guard, every servant, every person present turned to stare. "Explain," Kael said, his voice dangerously soft. Varen told them everything: the cellar, Lady Ashford's confession, Cyrus's involvement, the deal they'd tried to force, Kael's title and business holdings in exchange for Varen's life. "They're working together," she finished. "They want to destroy us both." Kael's expression was carved from ice. "Then we'll destroy them first." The city guards moved immediately. Half went to arrest Lady Ashford. The other half went to bring Lord Cyrus in for questioning. Kael sent his fastest messenger to the magistrate with a formal complaint. "You need to rest," he told Varen once the guards left. "I need to fight. You escaped a kidnapping. You're allowed to rest. I'm not a victim anymore." Varen caught his hand. "I'm done being the one who gets hurt while other people make plans. If we're doing this, we're doing it together." Kael looked at her, really looked, and something in his expression shifted. "All right, together. But first, a doctor." "Fine, but make it quick." The doctor declared her bruised, scraped, and remarkably lucky. No broken bones, no serious injuries beyond cuts that would heal. Kael hovered like she might disappear if he looked away, and Varen found herself oddly comforted by his paranoia. By noon, Lady Ashford was in custody. By evening, Lord Cyrus was being questioned by the magistrate, and by midnight, the whole ugly conspiracy was unraveling. Lady Ashford cracked first. Faced with kidnapping charges and the possibility of execution, she confessed everything. The fake theft accusation, the bribed witnesses, the plan to force Kyle into surrendering his holdings, and Cyrus's involvement in all of it. She's trying to negotiate, Garrett told them, offering to testify against Cyrus in exchange for leniency. Will it work? Varen asked. Depends on what Cyrus does. If he fights, he'll lose. Lady Ashford's testimony is damning. But if he's smart, he'll try to settle before this gets worse. Cyrus wasn't smart. He was proud. He demanded a hearing, insisted on his innocence, and made the mistake of calling Varen a liar in front of 3 magistrates and a room full of witnesses. Kyle stood before the court and dismantled him piece by piece. He presented evidence of Cyrus's debts, massive gambling losses that would be solved by controlling the Draven holdings. He showed correspondence between Cyrus and Lady Ashford discussing their mutual problem. He brought in the men who'd kidnapped Varen, who'd been caught fleeing the city and were very eager to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. By the end, Cyrus looked like exactly what he was, a desperate man who'd gambled everything and lost. The magistrate's verdict was swift. Lady Ashford would face trial for kidnapping, conspiracy, and false accusations. Lord Cyrus would be stripped of his family titles and expelled from the Draven household. The men who'd carried out the kidnapping would serve prison time. Justice, the head magistrate said, has been served. Varen sat in the gallery and felt something inside her chest finally unclench. Not relief, not yet, but something close to it. The scandal exploded across the city like wildfire. Within days, everyone knew the truth. Lady Ashford and Lord Cyrus had conspired to kidnap and possibly murder a woman because she dared to challenge social order. The gossip papers ran with it, the coffeehouses buzzed, and public opinion, which had been so firmly against Varen, began to shift. They're calling you brave, Miss... Brennan said, reading the morning paper over breakfast. One paper called you an example of resilience in the face of aristocratic corruption. Varen nearly choked on her tea. They what? You're a folk hero now, the servant who stood up to the powerful and won. That's not... I didn't do this to be a hero. I did it to survive. Sometimes those are the same thing. Mrs. Brennan folded the paper. Whether you wanted it or not, you've become a symbol. People see you as proof that the system can be challenged. The thought was terrifying. Varen had never wanted attention, had spent her whole life avoiding it, and now she was a symbol, a story, a lesson. I hate this, she said quietly. I know, but you're good at it anyway. The wedding was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Kyle wanted to wait longer, wanted to give Varen time to recover, to breathe, to not be in the center of a storm. But Varen insisted. If we wait, people will say I got scared, that I'm not ready, that I'm only marrying you for protection. She stood in Kyle's study, still healing but steadier now. I want to marry you while everyone's watching, while they can't deny that I chose this. You're certain? I've never been more certain of anything. The ceremony was held in the city's largest cathedral, and half the kingdom showed up. Nobles who'd sneered at Varen now watched with grudging respect. Common folk who'd never cared about aristocratic marriages packed the streets to see the servant who'd become a duchess. And at the altar, Kyle stood waiting with an expression that said he'd fight anyone who tried to stop this. Varen wore a dress that cost more than she'd earned in 10 years, ivory silk with delicate embroidery, a gift from a designer who'd read about her story and wanted to contribute. Her hands shook as she walked down the aisle, but she kept her head up, her spine straight. When she reached Kyle, he took her hand and whispered, "You can still run. So can you." Not a chance. The vows were traditional: honor, cherish, forsaking all others. But when Varen said them, she meant every word in ways the original writers probably never intended. She was vowing to honor truth over comfort, to cherish courage over safety, to forsake invisibility for visibility, no matter the cost. When Kyle kissed her, the crowd erupted in applause that shook the cathedral rafters. Duchess Varen Draven. The name felt impossible, foreign, like wearing someone else's skin. But as they left the cathedral and faced the cheering crowd, Varen realized something. She'd spent 15 years learning to be invisible. It had taken her 3 months to learn how to be seen. And she was still learning. The reception was held at the Draven estate, the same place where the family council had nearly destroyed them. But this time, the halls were filled with people who supported them. Business partners who valued competence over breeding. Nobles who were tired of old rules. Common folk who'd been given special invitations because Varen insisted. "This is unprecedented," one elderly duchess muttered to her companion, inviting merchants and shopkeepers to a ducal wedding. "Everything about this wedding is unprecedented," her companion replied. "Might as well embrace it." Varen overheard and smiled. Unprecedented. She could live with that. She found Kael on the terrace, stealing a moment of quiet away from the crowd. He'd loosened his cravat and looked more relaxed than she'd seen him in weeks. "Regretting it yet?" she asked. "Marriage or the circus?" "Both." "Neither." He pulled her close, his arms settling around her waist. "Though I wouldn't mind if everyone went home so I could have you to myself." "We have the rest of our lives for that." "Do we?" Kael's expression turned serious. "Varin, this isn't over. There will be more fights, more people who want to tear us apart, more scandals and accusations, and I know." She put her hand over his heart, feeling it beat steady and strong. "But we've survived everything they've thrown at us so far. We can survive what comes next." "You make it sound easy." "It's not easy. It's terrifying. But it's also ours." She looked up at him. "Everything we've built, everything we've fought for, it's ours. And that's worth fighting to keep." Kael studied her face for a long moment, then smiled. "When did you become so wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm just stubborn." "Same thing." He kissed her then, slow and thorough, and Varen let herself sink into it. Let herself feel safe. Let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd actually won. The celebration went late into the night. Music and dancing and toasts that ranged from sincere to scandalous. Varen danced with Kael, with business partners, with shopkeepers who'd never been to a noble wedding before and didn't know the proper steps. She didn't care about proper. She cared about real. Near midnight, Mrs. Brennan found her in the corridor, taking a break from the noise. "You did it," Mrs. Brennan said. "Did what?" "Survived. Won. Became exactly who you were supposed to be." Varen thought about that. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be. I'm just trying to be myself." "That's what I mean." Mrs. Brennan's expression softened. "When you first came to His Grace's household, you were so busy being invisible, I wasn't sure there was a real person under all that hiding. But there was, and she's exactly who we needed." The words hit harder than expected. Varen blinked against sudden tears. "Thank you. For vouching for me. For believing in me." "I didn't believe in you." Mrs. Brennan's smile was wry. "I thought you'd run within a week, but you proved me wrong. You proved everyone wrong. That's why this matters." A servant appeared with a message for Mrs. Brennan, and she excused herself, leaving Varen alone in the corridor. Through the open doors, she could see the ballroom, lights and music, and people celebrating a marriage that shouldn't have been possible. A year ago, Varen had been invisible, useful, disposable. Now she was a duchess, a symbol, a woman who'd looked at the world's rules and decided they didn't apply to her. The transformation still felt surreal. "There you are." Varen turned. Kael stood at the end of the corridor, backlit by ballroom lights, looking at her with an expression that made her chest tight. "Are you hiding from our own wedding?" he asked, just taking a breath. "Fair enough. It's been a long day." He moved closer. "Actually, it's been a long 3 months." "You could say that?" "I could say a lot of things." Kael stopped in front of her. "But mostly I want to say thank you." "For what?" "For choosing this. For choosing me. For not running when you had every reason to." His voice went quiet. "For making me remember what it's like to want something more than survival." Varen's throat tightened. "You saved me first." "No, I just saw you. You saved yourself. The truth of it settled between them, honest and complicated and real. "So what now?" Varen asked. "We're married. We've won. What comes next?" Kyle smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Now we live. Together. And we keep fighting whatever tries to stop us." That's not much of a plan. It's the only plan that matters. He was right. For the first time in her life, Varen wasn't planning for survival. She was planning for life. Real, messy, complicated life. And it was terrifying and exhilarating and exactly what she wanted. They returned to the ballroom together, hand in hand, and danced until dawn broke over the city. When the last guests finally left and the musicians packed their instruments, Varen stood in the center of the empty ballroom and spun once, her dress flaring around her. "What are you doing?" Kael asked, amused. "Remembering what this feels like." "What?" "Winning." She stopped spinning and looked at him. "I want to remember this moment, when we actually won. We haven't won everything yet. I know, but we've won enough." She crossed to him and took his hand. "We've won the right to be together, to make our own choices, to face whatever comes next on our terms. That's not nothing." "No," Kael agreed softly. "It's everything." The sun rose over the Draven estate, painting the ballroom in shades of gold and amber. Varen stood with her husband, her partner, her choice, and watched light fill the space where they danced and fought, and finally found solid ground. The world outside was still dangerous, still full of people who wanted to tear them apart, still ready to punish them for breaking rules that were never fair to begin with. But inside this moment, standing in this light, Varen felt something she'd never felt before. Hope. Not the desperate hope of survival, not the fragile hope of maybe things would get better someday. Real hope. The kind built on evidence and partnership and the absolute certainty that they would fight for each other no matter what. "Ready?" Kael asked. "For what?" "Everything," Varen smiled. "Yes, I'm ready." They left the ballroom together as equals, as partners, as two people who'd chosen each other over safety and survival and everything the world said they should want. Behind them, dawn light filled the empty space. Ahead of them, the future waited, uncertain, dangerous, and theirs. The first test came 6 weeks after the wedding, and it came from the crown itself. Varen was reviewing tenant reports in the study. She'd taken over managing the northern estates, much to the shock of Kael's steward, when Mrs. Brennan appeared in the doorway with an expression that meant trouble. "The palace sent a messenger," she said. "The queen wants to meet you." Varen's pen stilled on the page. "The queen? Tomorrow, for tea. That's not a request, is it?" "Royal invitations never are." Kael appeared behind Mrs. Brennan, reading over a similar summons. His jaw was tight. "She's heard about the scandal, about the trials, about us. And she wants to decide if I'm a threat or an opportunity," Varen finished. She set down her pen. "What happens if she doesn't approve?" "Then we have a very powerful enemy. We already have plenty of those. The queen is different. She can make laws, revoke titles, destroy us with a signature." Kael moved into the study, closing the door behind him. "This meeting matters, Varen." "I know." "Then you'll be careful. Diplomatic?" Varen looked at him. "When have I ever been diplomatic?" "That's what I'm afraid of." The queen's private sitting room was smaller than Varen expected, all cream silk and gold accents and windows that overlooked the palace gardens. Queen Meredith herself was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and elegant, with gray threading through dark hair, and an expression that suggested she'd heard every lie and seen every scheme the kingdom had to offer. "Duchess Draven," she said as Varen was announced. "How lovely to finally meet you." Varen curtsied, not too deep, not too shallow, exactly as Mrs. Brennan had drilled into her. "Your Majesty, thank you for the invitation. Sit, we have much to discuss." Tea was poured by servants who moved like shadows, and then the queen dismissed them with a gesture. They were alone. That felt significant. "You've caused quite a stir," the queen said, stirring sugar into her tea. "Kidnappings, trials, a servant marrying a duke. The gossip papers can't get enough of you." "I didn't intend to cause a stir, Your Majesty." "Didn't you?" The queen's gaze was piercing. You challenged Lady Ashford, exposed corruption, married above your station. These are not the actions of someone trying to stay quiet. Varen's hands tightened on her teacup. I was trying to survive. And in doing so, you've upset the entire social order. Do you understand what that means? It means people like Lady Ashford are angry. It means the system is fracturing. The Queen set down her cup. For centuries, we've maintained stability through clear hierarchies. Nobles marry nobles. Servants stay servants. Everyone knows their place. You've challenged that. With respect, Your Majesty, the system was already broken. It just took someone like me to prove it. The Queen's eyebrow rose. Explain. Varen took a breath. This was it. The moment where she could play it safe or speak truth. She chose truth. Lady Ashford spent 15 years exploiting servants, confident no one would challenge her because of her title. Lord Cyrus tried to steal a duchy because he thought blood mattered more than competence. Your system protected them until I refused to stay invisible. Varen met the Queen's eyes. If that breaks your social order, maybe the order was wrong to begin with. The silence stretched. The Queen studied her with an intensity that made Varen's skin prickle. Then the Queen smiled. You're either very brave or very foolish, she said. I haven't decided which. Can't I be both? Most people who are both don't survive long enough to marry dukes. The Queen picked up her tea again. Tell me, Duchess, what do you think should happen now? Should I reinforce the old rules, punish you for breaking them? Or should I acknowledge that perhaps you've exposed weaknesses that need addressing? It was a trap, had to be. But Varen couldn't see the angles, so she answered honestly. I think you should judge people by what they do, not where they come from. I think competence should matter more than bloodlines. And I think if the system can't handle someone like me succeeding, then the system is too fragile to last anyway. The Queen was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, My grandmother was a merchant's daughter. Did you know that? Varen's breath caught. No, Your Majesty. The scandal nearly destroyed the crown. Nobles threatened rebellion. The church refused to recognize the marriage. It took 10 years and 3 dead conspirators before the kingdom accepted her. The Queen's expression was distant, remembering. She taught me that power isn't about birth. It's about will. And you, Duchess Draven, have more will than most nobles I've met. I don't know if that's a compliment or a warning. It's both. The Queen stood, and Varen quickly followed. I'm not going to punish you, but I'm not going to protect you either. You've chosen a difficult path. Walk it carefully. I will, Your Majesty. Good, because I'll be watching, and if you succeed, if you prove that merit can triumph over birth, then perhaps it's time we made some changes. The Queen moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Duchess, your husband is pacing in the courtyard. You might want to put him out of his misery. Varen found Kael exactly where the Queen said he'd be, wearing a path in the cobblestones. Well, he demanded the moment he saw her, what did she say? She's not going to destroy us. That's good? That's very good. Varen caught his arm before he could start pacing again. She also told me her grandmother was a merchant's daughter. Kael went still. She told you that? Is it true? Yes, but it's not something the royal family advertises. If she told you, it means... He trailed off, something like hope flickering across his face. It means she sees you as an ally, or at least not an enemy. She said she's watching to see if I succeed. Then we'll make sure you do. The second test came from an unexpected source. The servants. 2 months after the royal tea, Varen received a letter from a housemaid in the Pemberton household. The woman, Margaret, wrote that she'd been dismissed without cause after speaking up about unfair wages. She'd heard about Varen's story and wondered if the Duchess might help. This is dangerous, Kael said when Varen showed him the letter. If you start intervening in other households' business, you'll make enemies of every noble family in the kingdom. Good. Maybe they'll think twice before exploiting their staff. Varen, I can't just ignore this. If I can help her, I should. Even if it costs us. Varen looked at him. You told me once that I made you remember what it's like to care about something other than survival. This is me caring. Are you going to stop me? Kael was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed. No, but I'm coming with you. They went to the Pemberton estate together. Lord Pemberton, the same man who'd blocked their path at the Merchants' Guild dinner, was not pleased to see them. "This is highly irregular," he blustered. "My household affairs are none of your concern." "They are when you're breaking employment laws," Varen said calmly. She'd done her research. "You dismissed Margaret without notice and without cause. That violates the Labor Protection Act of 1804. That act applies to factory workers, not household staff. Actually, it applies to anyone in paid employment. I checked with 3 different lawyers." Varen pulled out documentation. "You owe Margaret 4 weeks' wages plus references. Or we can take this to a magistrate and see how you like having your business practices examined publicly." Pemberton's face went red. "You're threatening me?" "I'm informing you of the law. What you do with that information is up to you." Pemberton looked between Varen and Kyle, clearly calculating his options. "Fine, she'll have her wages, but don't expect me to forget this, Duchess." "I don't expect you to forget it. I expect you to think twice before you dismiss someone unfairly again." They left with Margaret's wages secured and a promise of references. Word spread fast. Within weeks, Varen was receiving letters from servants across the city. Unfair dismissals, wage theft, abusive working conditions. Each one was a story of exploitation hidden behind closed doors and protected by social hierarchy. Varen couldn't fix everything, but she could fix some things. She set up a formal system. Servants could write to her, and she'd review cases with lawyers who specialized in employment law. If there was a legitimate grievance, she'd intervene. If not, she'd explain why. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. "You're building a movement," Garrett told her during one of their strategy sessions. "Whether you intend to or not." "I'm just helping people who need help." That's how movements start. Garrett leaned back in his chair. "Half the noble families in the kingdom are terrified of you now. They're calling you the servant Duchess. Some mean it as an insult, others mean it as a warning. Let them be terrified. Maybe they'll treat their staff better." The nickname stuck. The servant Duchess. Newspapers ran with it. Political cartoons depicted Varen standing between cowering nobles and empowered servants. Some were flattering. Most weren't. All of them made her famous. "This is getting out of control," Kyle said one evening. They were in their private sitting room, Varen reviewing letters while Kyle read business reports. "You're receiving death threats now." "I've been receiving death threats for months." "These are different, more organized. Someone's coordinating opposition." Varen set down her letters. "Do we know who?" "Several someones, a coalition of noble families who see you as a threat to their way of life." Kyle's expression was grim. "They're pushing for legislation to restrict your activities, calling it the Household Protection Act. Let me guess. It protects noble households from accountability? Essentially, it would make it illegal for third parties to interfere in household employment decisions." "That's insane." "That's politics, and they have enough votes to pass it." Varen stood and moved to the window. Outside, the city sprawled in all directions, full of people living and working and surviving in the shadows of a system that valued them only for their usefulness. "Then we fight it," she said. "How? We don't have votes in Parliament." "No, but we have something better." Varen turned to face him. "We have people, thousands of servants who've been helped by what we're doing. If they speak up, if they tell their stories publicly, Parliament will have to listen. That's never worked before. It's never been tried before. Not like this." Varen's mind was racing, pieces falling into place. "We organize them, give them a platform, show Parliament that servants aren't invisible. They're voters, consumers, people with voices that matter." Cale stared at her. "You want to start a social revolution?" "I want to finish what I started when I stopped being invisible. The question is whether you're with me." He didn't answer immediately. Varen watched him think, calculate, weigh the risks. This was bigger than protecting her, bigger than their marriage. This was about changing the fundamental structure of how their society worked. Finally, Kyle stood and crossed to her. "I'm with you. Always. But Varen, if we do this, there's no going back. Win or lose, everything changes." "Good. It should have changed a long time ago." They organized the rally for the steps of Parliament, 2 weeks before the Household Protection Act vote. Varen had expected maybe 100 people. 3,000 showed up. Servants and former servants, workers and tradespeople, families who'd been affected by exploitation and abuse. They filled the square, carrying signs and chanting for change, and Varen stood at the center of it feeling like she'd summoned something far bigger than herself. "You don't have to do this," Kael said beside her. He'd insisted on being there, along with a dozen guards. "Say the word, and we leave." "I'm not leaving." "Then let's make history." Varen climbed the steps to the makeshift platform. The crowd quieted, thousands of faces turning toward her. Her hands shook. Her voice nearly failed. But she thought about 15 years of invisibility, 3 months of fighting, and the thousands of people behind her who needed someone to speak for them. "My name is Varen Draven," she said, her voice carrying across the square. 6 months ago, I was a servant in Lady Ashford's household. I was invisible, useful, disposable, just like many of you. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. I stood here today because I refused to stay invisible, because I exposed corruption, survived kidnapping, and proved that people like us deserve better than exploitation. Varen's voice grew stronger. But I didn't do it alone. I did it because people believed in me, gave me chances, treated me like a human being instead of furniture. She gestured to the Parliament building behind her. Right now, in that building, there are people trying to pass a law that would make it illegal for anyone to help servants who are being abused. They call it the Household Protection Act. But it's not protecting households. It's protecting abusers. The crowd's murmur turned angry. They want you to stay invisible, Varen continued. They want you to stay quiet. They want you to accept that being born in a certain place means accepting certain treatment. But I'm here to tell you that's a lie. You deserve fair wages, safe working conditions, the right to speak up without losing everything. You deserve to be seen. The crowd erupted in cheers. Varen waited for it to quiet, then delivered her final point. Parliament thinks you don't matter. Let's prove them wrong. Write your representatives, tell your stories, vote in the next election. Show them that we're not invisible anymore, and we're not going away. The cheers were deafening. Varen stepped back, her legs shaking, and Kael caught her elbow. That was incredible, he said. That was terrifying. Same thing. The rally made every newspaper in the kingdom. Political cartoons showed Varen on the Parliament steps, depicted variously as a hero, a threat, and a revolutionary. Opinion pieces argued whether she was a dangerous radical or a necessary reformer, and Parliament noticed. The Household Protection Act vote was delayed for review, then delayed again. Representatives who'd been confident votes suddenly became uncertain. The coalition of noble families who'd pushed for the legislation found themselves facing organized opposition for the first time. They're scared, Garrett reported. Half of Parliament is getting letters from constituents supporting you. They can't ignore that kind of pressure. Will it be enough? Varen asked. I don't know, but it's more than we've ever had before. The vote came 3 weeks later. Varen and Kael sat in the public gallery, watching as representatives debated the act for 6 hours. Arguments flew back and forth, tradition versus progress, stability versus change, the rights of property owners versus the rights of workers. When the vote was finally called, Varen held her breath. The Household Protection Act failed by 12 votes. The gallery erupted in cheers and shouts. Varen sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. They'd won. Actually, won. Varen, Kael said softly. We did it. She turned to him, tears streaming down her face. We did. He pulled her into his arms, and Varen let herself break, not from despair this time, but from relief and exhaustion and the crushing weight of hope finally realized. They'd changed something, actually changed it. The victory wasn't complete. There were still hundreds of households exploiting servants, still thousands of people trapped in bad situations, still a system that valued birth over merit and protected abusers more than victims. But they'd proven change was possible. And that was everything. The aftermath was messy. Noble families who'd supported the act retaliated where they could. Social exclusion, business pressure, pointed snubs. But Varen and Kael had allies now, too. The Queen sent a private note of congratulations. Merchants who employed workers fairly reached out with support. And servants across the kingdom kept writing letters, kept sharing stories, kept refusing to be invisible. You've started something you can't stop, Mrs. Brennan said one morning. She'd brought Varen tea in the study, where Varen was reviewing the latest stack of correspondence. People are organizing, forming groups, demanding better treatment. Is that bad? It's unprecedented. Whether it's bad depends on what they do with it. What do you think they'll do? Mrs. Brennan was quiet for a moment. I think they'll keep fighting because you showed them fighting is possible. That's a dangerous gift. Good. Let it be dangerous. The old way wasn't safe. It was just familiar. 3 months after the vote, Varen received an invitation to speak at the university. A professor wanted her to address students about social reform and the changing nature of class structures. You're becoming a political figure, Kael observed. Is that what you want? I don't know what I want. I just know I can't go back to being invisible. You couldn't if you tried. You're too visible now. The university lecture hall was packed. Students, professors, journalists, and curious observers filling every seat and standing in the aisles. Varen stood at the podium and looked at faces eager to hear what the servant Duchess had to say. She talked about survival, about the difference between living and existing, about how systems that seem unchangeable can fracture when enough people refuse to accept them. I'm not a revolutionary, she said near the end. I'm just someone who got tired of being afraid, who decided that surviving wasn't enough anymore, and who learned that one person speaking truth can start something bigger than themselves. A student raised her hand. But what if speaking truth costs everything? What if you lose? Then you lose. But at least you tried. At least you fought instead of accepting that someone else's rules should define your life. Varen paused. I'd rather fail trying to change things than succeed at staying invisible. The applause was thunderous. After the lecture, a young woman approached, barely 20, dressed in servant's clothes, her eyes bright with determination. Duchess, she said, I work in Lord Harrington's household. He's breaking wage laws. I want to report him, but I'm scared. Varen recognized that fear, had lived it for 15 years. Report him, Varen said. And if you need help, come find me. You don't have to be invisible anymore. The woman's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. She left, and Varen stood alone in the emptying lecture hall, thinking about how many more women like that existed. How many people were still trapped, still invisible, still afraid. She couldn't save them all, but she could keep fighting, keep speaking, keep refusing to accept that the system was unchangeable. 1 year after the Ashford Ball, Varen and Kyle hosted their own winter gathering. Not a ball. Varen hated balls, but a reception for everyone who'd helped them. Lawyers and servants, merchants and reformers, people from every level of society mixing in ways that would have been scandalous a year ago. This is chaos, Kyle said, watching a university professor debate employment law with a former housemaid. This is progress, Varen corrected. Same thing, Garrett approached with news. The Queen just announced a royal commission on labor reform. She's appointed you as an advisor. Varen nearly dropped her glass. What? Apparently Her Majesty was impressed by your speech. She wants your perspective on modernizing employment laws. I don't know what that is. Historic, Kyle said. That's what it is. The reception continued around them, voices raised in debate and laughter, and the messy, complicated work of change. Varen stood in the center of it and felt something she'd never felt before. Belonging. Not because she'd earned a title or married a duke, but because she'd stopped hiding who she was and what she believed, because she'd fought for something bigger than survival. Later that night, after the guests had left and the house was quiet, Varen and Kale stood on their terrace looking at the city spread below them. Do you ever miss it? Kyle asked. Being invisible? Sometimes, when things get too loud or too complicated or too much. Varen leaned against his shoulder. But then I remember what invisible felt like, how small it made me, how it ate away at everything I could have been. And now? Now I'm exhausted and terrified and constantly fighting battles I'm not sure I can win. She smiled. But I'm alive. Really alive. Not just surviving. Kale was quiet for a moment. I was surviving too, before you. Just going through the motions, protecting what was mine, never risking anything real. You changed that. I changed everything. Yes. You did. He turned to face her, and I wouldn't change it back for anything. Varen looked at this man who'd seen her when no one else would, who'd defended her when it was dangerous, who'd chosen her over safety and tradition and everything society said mattered. We make a good team, she said. We make a dangerous team. Even better. They stood together in the darkness, looking at the city they were slowly, impossibly changing. There would be more fights, more enemies, more moments when victory seemed impossible and defeat inevitable. But they'd survived worse, together. And that was the point, wasn't it? Not survival for its own sake, but survival for the chance to build something better, to change things, to prove that the old rules didn't have to be the only rules. 6 months later, the Royal Commission released its recommendations: new labor protections, mandatory wage standards, legal pathways for servants to report abuse without fear of retaliation. It wasn't everything Varen wanted, but it was a start. The day the reforms passed into law, Varen stood in the same square where she'd given her speech and watched people celebrate. Former servants who now had legal protections, workers who could speak up without losing everything, families who no longer had to choose between survival and dignity. A reporter approached with questions about her next fight, her next cause, her next revolution. I don't know, Varen said honestly. I'm still figuring this out as I go. But you'll keep fighting. Always. That's what visibility means. You can't look away anymore. Not from injustice, not from people who need help, not from the fact that things should be better. The reporter scribbled notes. One more question, Duchess. Do you consider yourself a revolutionary? Varen thought about that. About the terrified girl in the Ashford ballroom. About the woman who'd chosen visibility over safety. About everything she'd become in the space between. No, she said finally. I consider myself someone who refused to stay invisible. Everything else just followed from that. The reporter left, and Varen stood alone in the square, watching people celebrate a victory that seemed impossible a year ago. Kael appeared beside her, as he always did. Ready to go home? In a minute, I want to remember this. What? What winning looks like. What change looks like. What happens when enough people decide the old rules don't work anymore? Kael took her hand. You did this. We did this. All of us. Varen gestured to the celebrating crowd. Every person who spoke up, every servant who refused to stay quiet, every ally who stood with us instead of against us. This is what happens when people stop being invisible. They walked home through streets full of celebration, past people whose lives would be different because of laws that hadn't existed a year ago. The system wasn't fixed, wouldn't be fixed for decades, maybe longer, but it was cracking, changing, becoming something new. And Varen had helped start that change. Not because she was special, not because she was perfect, but because she'd been brave enough to be seen, to stand up, to fight when fighting seemed impossible. That night, in their private sitting room, Varen and Kael reviewed requests for help from 3 different households. The work never ended. But it mattered. Every letter, every case, every small victory was a piece of something larger. You know this is your life now, Kael said. Fights and causes, and changing the world one law at a time. I know. You're certain that's what you want? Varen set down the letters and looked at him. I spent 15 years being invisible because it was safe. I'm done choosing safety over truth. Done accepting that the world can't change because it's always been a certain way. If fighting is what it takes to make things better, then fighting is what I'll do. Even when it's exhausting? Especially then. Kael smiled, that real, genuine smile that said he understood exactly what she meant. Then we keep fighting. Together. Always together. They worked late into the night, reviewing cases and planning strategies and building the foundation for whatever came next. Outside, the city slept. Inside, 2 people who'd chosen each other over everything else kept working. Because visibility wasn't just about being seen, it was about what you did with that sight, how you used attention to help others, how you transformed your own survival into something that mattered beyond yourself. Varen had learned to survive by being invisible. She'd learned to live by being seen. And she'd learned that the space between survival and living was where real change happened, where one person's courage could inspire thousands, where refusing to accept injustice could fracture systems that seemed unbreakable. The old rules said servants should stay servants. That blood mattered more than competence, that challenging the system would only destroy you. Varen had proven every one of those rules wrong. Not perfectly, not without cost, but undeniably. And in doing so, she'd shown everyone who'd ever felt invisible that they didn't have to stay that way, that fighting was possible, that change, however difficult, was real. Years later, historians would debate what started the Great Reform movement. Some would point to economic factors, others to political shifts. A few would mention the servant Duchess and her impossible marriage. But the people who'd lived it knew the truth. It started with one woman in a ballroom, refusing to be invisible, and it changed everything. Varen Draven stood at her window on a spring morning 5 years after that first ball and watched the sun rise over a city that was different because she'd lived in it. Not perfect, not fixed, but different. Beside her, Kyle stirred. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep, too much to do." "There's always too much to do. That's not going to change." "I know." Varen turned from the window and smiled. "But at least now, when I look at the work ahead, I see possibility instead of impossibility. That's worth something." "It's worth everything." He joined her at the window, and they stood together as morning light painted the city gold. Below them, people were waking, working, living their lives in ways big and small. Some would face the same injustices Varen had fought. Others would benefit from the changes she'd helped create. All of them would navigate a world slightly better than the one before. And somewhere in that city, another invisible person was probably making the choice Varen had made 5 years ago, choosing to be seen, choosing to fight, choosing to prove that survival wasn't enough when real living was possible. That person's story was just beginning. But Varen's, the girl who'd learned to disappear and then learned to be seen, that story had become something larger than herself. A symbol, a possibility. Proof that the harshest worlds could be changed by people brave enough to refuse their assigned place. In the harsh hierarchy of high society, she'd existed as a shadow, useful, silent, disposable. Until one night, a duke looked at her and saw a person, and that single moment fractured everything. What came after wasn't easy, wasn't smooth, wasn't the fairy tale people later claimed it was. But it was real. And it was hers. And when Varen looked back at the girl in the Ashford ballroom, terrified and invisible, and slowly dying from survival without living, she felt something fierce and proud and unshakable. She'd survived. She'd fought. She'd changed the world. Not alone. Never alone. But she'd started it. She'd been brave enough to be seen, and in the harshest worlds, that was how victory began. With one person refusing to disappear, with one choice to stand instead of hide, with one moment of courage that rippled outward until the impossible became inevitable. Varen Hale, Varen Draven, the servant. Duchess had learned the most important lesson of all. Survival begins with hiding, but victory belongs to those brave enough to be seen. And she would spend the rest of her life making sure that everyone who needed to hear that message had the chance to learn it too.